Hello, everybody. My name is Mark Pickett, and I'm a Technology Transfer Program Manager for SAE Government Technologies. If you're not familiar with us, SAE Government Technologies collaborates with government, industry, and academia to solve tough technical challenges in the mobility space. Welcome to another SAE Government Technologies LinkedIn Live event. Today, we're talking about supply chain vulnerability and resiliency strategies. We have a fantastic guest for you. Firstly, I want to thank my talented colleagues, Tracy and Charlie, who are at the controls making today possible. So thanks very much. Today, we're here with Pete Guinto. Pete is the president of Government, Defense, and Aerospace for Resilinc. Pete has an incredible background, including various senior level contracting positions within the U.S. Air Force, to include the COVID-19 task force. Pete also has a law degree from the University of Akron. Try not to hold that against him. And I also say, fun fact, Pete, back in his career, was a respiratory therapist, so pretty bright guy. Welcome, Pete.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks for having me. Really happy to be here today to talk about my favorite topics.
Thank you. We're happy to have you as well. Speaking of supply chain, I hope your holiday shopping is all done.
It's getting there. It's getting there. I've delegated much of that responsibility to other members of the household.
Very wise. So, Pete, tell us about your current role and what it is that you do.
Sure. I'm the president of Government, Defense, and Aerospace for Resilinc. So I lead teams both on the client delivery side, but also on the new business development side and the solution side. So we're every day trying to figure out ways to better serve our clients, to help them to understand the risks that are inherent within their supply chains. So what we specifically do at Resilinc, we help our clients to understand multi-tier vulnerabilities within their supply chains. Now, some folks aren't familiar with the term, the tiering term in supply chain, but essentially, if you source from company A, who sources from company B, company A is your tier 1 vendor, and company B would be your tier 2 vendor. So the vast majority of businesses and organizations don't have a lot of visibility into who those vendors are at that tier 2 level or below. Some clients even lack visibility into tier 1 vendors, particularly at a consolidated company-wide level. So it's not uncommon for businesses to grow and expand and add in new ERP and MRP systems as they do, which kind of creates a lack of visibility at the company level in terms of who's even all of the suppliers at tier 1. And also the use of group purchasing organizations and distributors to do a lot of purchasing for businesses in different sectors creates that lack of visibility there too. So we help our clients to understand who's at tier 2, who's at tier 3 and below, to help them to get ahead of risks. So I like to kind of summarize the problem in just one little neat example. So if a disruption happens down at tier 4 or tier 5, let's say it's at tier 5, the tier 4 vendor is going to try to fix things before they alert the tier 3 vendor, right? They don't want to be replaced in the supply chain. They want to avoid late delivery fees or potentially liquidated damages if that's been negotiated into their contract. So they want to try to make sure things work. But ultimately, when it doesn't work, they alert the tier 3 vendor, and the cycle repeats itself. The tier 3 vendor wants to avoid the same things the tier 4 vendor did. So when you add all these months, the end of the supply chain, the OEM or the purchaser, they may find out about this disruption that happened down at tier 5, 6 or 8 months too late. So having that visibility into who's there, having continuous monitoring of each of those folks within the supply chain, and also having those folks networked on the same platform, so communication can flow rapidly from the OEM down to the low tier vendor, is how we ultimately create a return on investment for our clients, and that's what really keeps us in business.
No, thanks for that. I appreciate it. And I think that analogy or that explanation of the multi-tier and the lack of transparency, you can just start to see how if you have a disruption down in the tier, it's going to have a ripple effect throughout that supply chain that could be unrecoverable.
That's it, Mark. When supply chains cease to move, those disruptions can be very expensive. So expenses from just idle personnel tend to be a really big expense. A supply chain disruption, for instance, in the automotive industry that disrupts a manufacturing line causes about $1.6 million in lost revenue per hour. So these things can be very, very expensive when production's frozen. But in addition to that, generally it costs a lot of money to get things moving fast enough, paying things like expedite fees to vendors, sometimes to vendors who weren't selected to be your primary vendor. And later you go back begging for their supplies, the price is going to go up dramatically. Other things like employee time to do site visits to figure out what's exactly happening, and then later do a site visit to the next lower tier. All of these things just cost money, so they reduce operating margins. And in the end of the day, when supply chains freeze, they reduce revenue. So big financial impacts are possible when things aren't managed optimally.
Absolutely. Just an aside message to the audience. At the end, we'll answer questions. So if you have a question along the course of today's program, just go ahead and put it in the comment section. Thank you, Charlie, for that message. And then later on, we'll have some ways to contact both Pete and myself if you want to have an offline conversation. Pete, I know the pandemic highlighted supply chain issues. From your macro perspective, paint the supply chain landscape for us today.
Sure. So over the course of the last 20 or 30 years, supply chains changed dramatically. So first, there was a big move towards horizontal integration. So large companies that used to make things from the ground up started outsourcing. And typically, 30 years ago, this was outsourcing to regional partners. So instead of Ford building everything in the vehicle, they decided that, well, we're going to source tires and we're not going to make tires. Somebody else can do it and they can get really good at it. So horizontal integration really happened for a couple reasons. And really, it's because it works, right? So the big reason on the cost side, as companies can focus on one core capability and then produce at scale, they can advance way further down in the improvement curve and also purchase things at scale that's not possible for a vertically integrated company. Vendor management is another big element there. So for a large company dealing with a large business unit that is performing poorly, typically it's far easier for the corporate leadership to tell a vendor, hey, we're going to go with somebody else, or we're going to compete that requirement. When you're building stuff internally, it's typically not quite that easy. So it makes it easier to manage the vendor base. It's easier to manage the vendor base than internal company divisions at sometimes. So these effects were then spread across the globe through global diversification, which is essentially horizontal integration using, instead of a regional base, using the base of the world. So when you could tap into other marketplaces, you take advantage of the comparative advantages of different regions, and they could vary from global logistics footprint, so being able to distribute things quickly at a low cost, moving things faster. Also taking advantage of things like taxes or different legal restrictions that are in place on things like environmental restrictions or labor. Cost of labor tends to be a really big one in that area too. So this landscape that developed over time created really the complexity that I described to start the call, Mark. So companies, instead of having a small group of vendors, now can have hundreds of vendors, and they could act more as an integrator than a manufacturer. And then those hundreds of vendors often are doing the same thing. So they're integrating at a lower tier and sourcing from hundreds of vendors or thousands of vendors at the next lowest tier. I actually have one client who's a large manufacturer in aerospace mobility and power generation. And I know them really well. They have 16,000 tier one vendors. And that extends to about 120,000 vendors at tier two. So as you can see, as you go deeper in the supply chain, the number of vendors that are present just explodes. So this is really what created much of the disruption during the COVID times. So when you had a little ripple in a supply chain, 20,000 miles away, that ripple turned into a large wave for lots of companies. So when they saw that they might be sole sourced at a tier 2 or tier 3 level, and now they're cut off from this sole source. They couldn't produce goods, they lost revenue, they lost profit, and they've kind of seen the light that we might actually need to be more deliberate in the way we design our multi-tiered supply chain. So many companies are gaining visibility into those low tiers. They're collaborating more with their vendors to try to encourage vendors, even at a lower tier where they don't have privity of contract, to rely on more dual source or multi-sourced relationships within low tier vendors. And they're trying to move risk away from concentrating in just one region. So one term we hear a lot is China plus one. So the inherent vulnerabilities of having too many vendors in China never could have been more clear than during COVID. The enhanced geopolitical instability in that region, the potential for a China-Taiwan conflict has made more companies even more acutely aware of the dangers of relying specifically on one nation. So a lot of companies have moved towards a China plus one strategy, trying to create additional sources of supply, so they're not just relying on one geopolitical partner. Even beyond China plus one strategies, more companies are moving towards multi and dual sourcing just broadly as a strategy to make sure that they can hit capacity numbers when they anticipate greater demand in the future that will obviously result in them having to increase the supply of the good to maximize their revenue.
Yeah. So as companies build redundancy or multiple vendors in their supply chain to do the same thing, how are they balancing risk mitigation with cost? Because as you put less volume on a vendor, their price may be a little bit more than it would have been with a higher volume or a sole source relationship. So can you speak to the balance of risk mitigation and cost mitigation?
Absolutely. So I would say most vendors, so the best companies are doing these things very deliberately. So here's a good example. When you're going to create a dual source for a particular component,
Mm-hmm.
and you're going to say, again, I'll use company A and B. Say you're using company A today, and you want to bring on company B. And company B is going to have to go through whatever the internal certification process is. And for many of my clients, an additional step to do things like FAA airworthiness, so that this part from a particular vendor can be certified to be used by your company and the things that you make and sell to other companies. So as companies go through this process, the best companies are acutely aware of one particular risk, and that's the risk of company B utilizing the same or similar vendors as company A. I'll use aerospace again, and critical infrastructure as two great examples here. So aerospace and critical infrastructure are anticipating an enormous demand spike in the next 10 to 15 years. So on the commercial aircraft side, the growing middle class population of the globe, also the aging fleet of aircraft that are deployed commercially across the globe that are going to need to be replaced, are going to create a huge demand spike. On the critical infrastructure side, the world is electrifying. Governments across the globe are spending money to update their critical infrastructure. The government here in the U.S. had a $1.2 trillion infrastructure rebuild package, which honestly was very badly needed. And then state jurisdictions, including like Minnesota, who created their own $2 billion pool for infrastructure rebuild, is going to drive an enormous amount of demand into the marketplace. So as you are looking at company A and company B to meet future demand, if they're relying on the same sub-tier sources of supply, you would have invested a bunch of money bringing on company B and your capacity hasn't actually expanded at all. So from a cost and pricing standpoint, again, the best companies don't do winner-take-all competitions. So winner-take-all competitions can result in really good prices in the instant buy. And let's say you set up a long-term agreement, maybe you get 5 years of pricing in that long-term agreement that are pretty good. So after 5 years, that competitor, company B, that might have been able to compete with company A to keep those prices low, they might not be around anymore. They might not be willing to participate.
Right.
So really, the best companies compete through indirect competition. They deliberately assure that their vendor base stays healthy, that the number of vendors stays high, and then they carry that competition over a longer term. And again, they get insight into who exists at the lower tier to make sure that if both of those companies are relying on the same source supply, creating what we call a tragedy of the commons, that they can rectify that issue before it becomes a revenue dampening impact.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we're seeing on our side at SAE, the enterprise, as companies in the supply chain of various sectors are trying to become qualified. Performance Review Institute is an affiliate of SAE International, and they are performing over 4,000 AS 9100 audits a year, and are very involved in supply chain oversight programs where quality and safety are shared values. So we see that. So we talked a little bit about industry, and I appreciate your perspective because you've got a tremendous background. I want to ask this next question, but I think it's kind of a double-edged question, and that's about government investment. What are governments doing to invest in this problem's solution? And I think in terms of funding, like you just mentioned, in terms of infrastructure, but also the geopolitical climate where adversarial nations are investing in protecting assets and protecting raw materials. And I wonder if you could maybe shed some light on both components of that question.
Yeah, definitely. So I would say broadly that all governments across the globe have become active market participants. So in the past, many nations would try to not tinker with marketplaces, try to avoid interfering with traditional free market tendencies. But I think what everyone has seen is the whole globe doesn't operate as a free market. And as a result, tinkering by one nation really requires tinkering by other nations just to assure that things remain resilient. So, I mean, it's no surprise, and it's no secret. China's tinkering within the marketplace, particularly in intermediate and raw materials, over the last 20 or 30 years, has resulted in enormous fragility within our supply chains. So you see it in things like Defense Production Act, where prior to COVID, Defense Production Act Title III, so that's the DPA where the government doesn't force a company to make something. It's a voluntary process. Was spending about $50 million a year to create additional domestic capacity. So during COVID in 2020, that was closer to $5 billion, with money invested not just by the Department of Defense, but also by the Department of Health and Human Services. Because what we found during COVID was, hey, this is not just a defense unique thing. This is all of the commercial marketplace. So things that were traditionally not viewed as a potential national security threat, things like N95 masks, things like syringes and saline and dialysis machines. We found that, the government is not going to be able to purchase these to support our war efforts, but broadly, our people won't have the things that they need. So we had to, react at scale and make some big investments to try to enhance domestic capacity, but also friendly capacity too, right? Moving supply chains from Southeast Asia to Latin America and South America has been, and this is something pushed by folks in the government, but largely by industry as well. So I think that market participant activity certainly starts there, but it extends out both to the supply and demand side. Right. So on the supply side, you've seen the government create trade restrictions with China on certain things. The one that's in the news constantly is NVIDIA's most modern chips that help support some AI type capabilities that we really don't want to have in the hands of our adversaries. So we're seeing more trade restrictions on commercial goods that historically would have been reserved for military goods through the ITAR and ER restrictions. We're also seeing other governments respond in kind, right? So China has instituted several trade restrictions in the recent past. So Graphite, I think, is the most recent, but before that, it was germanium and gallium. Before that, it was highly purified silicates that were, they're using the wafer
Yeah.
fabrication process. So
Hmm.
all these geopolitical market participant actions that are, seemingly non-military, they really highlight that there's kind of an economic warfare battle that's kind of being waged right now.
I appreciate those comments, Pete. You know, you mentioned raw material constraints, and so SAE became involved last year, 2022, with a grant designation from the Office of Local Defense Community Cooperation, because the U.S. government has identified approximately 30 critical elements that are important to national security or defense supply chains. And so we received a grant to demonstrate a extraction technique to harvest scandium from waste streams in the United States. And this consortia type of approach to problem solving or mitigating supply chain risk for critical elements starts with this element and will expand to others. And as you probably are well aware, scandium is important to high performance aluminum alloys for things like hypersonics, microelectronics. And so we're actively engaged in supply chain risk mitigation for critical elements. And that sort of leads me to this next, we talk about national security and DoD and the defense industrial base, but the automotive sector, I think you mentioned that earlier today about the aspirations to grow the electric vehicle space and improve and increase adoption. Well, that's going to increase the critical element demand to support battery production. And so do you have any comments there specifically in the automotive sector?
Yeah, so specifically the automotive sector, but broadly too. So it is really, really critical that folks do a good job mapping out their supply chain in a space like this, because it's not just where a raw material comes from, which is critically important, but it's also where that raw material is processed, where that raw material is turned into an intermediate material that can be used in an actual product. So oftentimes, what we would sometimes consider an indirect material supply chain can be even more impactful than direct material supply chains. That includes, again, not just the consumables that are used to in the secondary processing facilities to make things usable, but also includes things like specialized tooling for manufacturing. Oftentimes, specialized tooling and the consumables that are used for tooling have lead times that vastly exceed the direct materials. So if you lose your specialized tooling, you might have an 18 to 24-month lead time to replace that piece of machinery. And for
Right.
supply chains, again, that have a potential to lose a lot of revenue when they're not moving, this is really critically important. So for automotive companies, understanding what their low tier dependencies are for direct and indirect material will really help them to optimize their investment in suppliers and ultimately their selection of suppliers. Right, having selection criteria that encourages resilience from the low tiers will drive resilience. Right, this is in business. Everybody responds to incentives. Right, so creating those incentives in different contracting arrangements, creating visibility and transparency within the supply chain, also critically important in this space. One other thing, and it wasn't direct part of the question, but the automotive industry has been impacted significantly by a bunch of other regulations too, namely the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, the German Supply Chain Act, and then additional regulations that are being created by many other countries, including Canada. So this is less an issue of operational resilience, and it's more an issue of ESG or just fair treatment of employees throughout the globe. So UFLPA specifically is aimed at preventing forced labor, slave labor, and child labor that's been well documented to happen in the Xinjiang province of China against the Uyghur people. German Supply Chain Due Diligence Act addresses that as well. But as we look across supply chains, developing nations that are becoming part of global supply chains, they'll use the DRC, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, for an example, that creates much of the world's, is the source of much of the world's cobalt. They're becoming intertwined in supply chains, and sometimes we don't like the way that they treat the people that are digging things out of the mines. So in addition to the just understanding the changing dynamics of batteries, really just understanding where things come from is becoming materially important to companies who want to avoid sanctions and also be allowed to keep selling their vehicles in their total addressable marketplace.
Yeah, good comments, Pete. We talked about transparency a couple of times. Coming from a tier one supplier in the commercial trucking industry, I know my leadership had I would say, an adverse reaction to being transparent throughout the supply chain. But transparency is important to get, line of sight notice well in advance of a problem that's coming. Do you see resistance in the supply chains to have transparency? And I want to get to a question here in a minute about the types of tools that facilitate transparency. But I think there's varying degrees of acceptance in terms of being open and transparent about my supply chain down the network to support the upward part of the supply chain or the key OEM or prime integrator.
So largely no, but in instances yes. So I think really this transparency piece, it's not just the vendors, it's actually the buyers too. So I think buyers are largely becoming more transparent with the folks that that supply them for many reasons. One is to more accurately predict for their vendors what they're going to buy and when. It helps their vendors to perform more optimally, right? They can schedule their production builds and make sure they do things in the most efficient way possible to help drive down prices. Additionally, the best OEMs, the best large companies that manage big supply chains are doing, again, two things that really drive this forward. So the first thing, I already kind of mentioned it, hey, being transparent down to the supply chain, right? Talking to the members of supply chain, letting them know why they're collecting this information, and also clearly communicating that, hey, this is an attempt to optimize the entire supply network, right? So if we at Ford can sell more vehicles because we keep our production line hot, you will sell more pieces of supply to us to increase both what we sell today and customer satisfaction in the future. So this was a network effect thing that's going to benefit us all. The second thing that many of these big companies are doing is they're making this a matter of competitive advantage, right? So if this becomes a contract requirement that you're going to be transparent, now if you're transparent, you're going to win business, and if you're not, you won't. So again, lots of large companies are building this into their supply relationships, and again, creating both carrots and sticks, right? The carrot is we're all going to get better, and the stick is you're not going to be my vendor if you don't do this. Now,
that makes sense.
Yeah, one other thing that that is a big carrot in this space is utilizing platforms that help the vendors to realize efficiencies as well. Right. So one of the things that we do for our clients, I mentioned, we do continuous monitorings of supply chain. This is a great place to apply AI and machine learning. So we monitor about 105 million sources of information, everything from local news to national news, government bulletins, and even social media across 130 languages. So when something happens in the supply chain, our clients know about it really quickly. So if you're a tier 2 vendor to one of these large companies, odds are most of your supply chain disruptions emanate from your low tier vendors too. So when a company helps to monitor their entire supply chain, it helps those low tier vendors get ahead of supply issues as well, because nobody wants to be that problem vendor that had a disruption that created a big delay in product and revenues go down.
Right. So the audience, if you have a question for Pete, Charlie, if you could please put that in the comments or the section there. I see comments from people in the audience. I appreciate that. I see Misty, you're out there in the audience. Thank you for your your nice comment there. And again, if you have a question for myself or Pete on this topic, please put it in the comments section. I think I have, I've got a question coming in, Pete. I think we talked a little bit about China and Taiwan. Very high level, we talk about global conflict. We talk about funding constraints. You see in the news, we're spending a lot of money on all kinds of different fronts, including supporting allies and rebuilding infrastructure. China invades Taiwan. What happens from a supply perspective?
So instantly, I think we would see, at a minimum, a response on the economic side that mirrored what happened when Russia invaded the Ukraine. I will say it'll be much more difficult on any nation that wants to stop buying things from China than it was when Russia invaded, because China is a relatively small, or sorry, Russia and the Ukraine both are relatively small economic players in comparison to China and Taiwan. So I think the next thing that we would see, and again, this is at a minimum because the military response would be a big factor here too. But the next thing we would see is that companies who have sole source dependency on China and Taiwan and don't know about it would slowly learn over the course of the next month that they're not going to be able to deliver what they could before. Right? There's the toilet paper gathering effect that happened during COVID would essentially happen on material supply chains, as many companies would panic and try to secure as much inventory as they could of the things that they viewed as critical in those coming months. And then later they would kind of find out that there are some things that they may have purchased that could be sourced from somewhere else outside of China and Taiwan, that they bought excess inventories of, while not focusing on other things that had low tier dependence on those items, which is, by the way, exactly what happened during COVID. I have a COVID example, and I would just see this example playing out over and over again. During the COVID response, we purchased millions of test kits, and we invested in capacity for test kits with lots of vendors. And all of those vendors came back to us about 3 weeks later to tell us they had the same problem. They couldn't get something called a flocked nasal swab. So that Q-tip that they would jam up your nose, make you really uncomfortable, was not a normal Q-tip. It was a specialized Q-tip that if you used anything else would render the tests ineffective. And there was only one domestic manufacturer, a company called Puritan Swab up in Maine. And the rest, they came from the international marketplace. So I think over the coming months, we would see this where individual businesses were identified as critical suppliers because goods weren't flowing, and the governments across the world would have to act in unison to try to create resilience across the allied countries that were not sourcing from China anymore. But ultimately, I don't know how long we could sustain that. Again, with Russia, we can sustain sanctions with Russia essentially indefinitely. With China, I don't know that that's the case.
Yeah, scary stuff. Hopefully it doesn't happen, but it's not looking too good some days. Thank you. Fascinating. Very much appreciate your perspective, Pete. Another comment here. What are your recommendations on eliminating the gaps in the supply chain where bad actors are introducing counterfeit parts?
So the first step is knowing they're there. This is one area that I have personal experience with in my defense time, where some counterfeit components were introduced into some of our weapon systems. I can't name the weapon systems, but I can tell you the components, which are the world's most counterfeited items. They were Cisco network switches and routers. So in the space of counterfeiting and something that's called gray sourcing, the actors that are doing these things are generally bad actors. So what they do is try to avoid a paper trail in any way possible. That's critically important when companies are looking at mapping out their supply chains. There are tools to use public information, commercial information, and AI and ML technologies to do some mapping upfront. But this mapping really just maps relationships, and it relies on documentation in the form of bills of lading, trade and shipment documentation to be available. So if you're a bad actor in the supply chain, you are doing everything you can to avoid these things. So bills of lading, for instance, are only required when there is a common carrier. So if you're a company who delivers things on your own, yes, you're not using a common carrier. If you have a company that is using an exclusive carrier, so all the things that are on the truck are yours, there's not going to be a bill of lading, and this will create what I call a false negative in the supply chain mapping using just commercially and publicly available information. So really, the only way to really assure that counterfeit items are not used and make sure those things never make it to your shipping dock is to map out your supply chains, to work in close collaboration with everybody in the supply network to make sure that they're identifying who bad sources are and preventing those bad sources of supply from entering supply chains. And typically that's going to happen at a low tier.
Yeah, thank you, Pete. Interesting perspective. Again, the audience, if you have a question or a comment, put it in the comments section. If you have a question for me, my email, Charlie, maybe pop that up here one last time. And I think we're going to wind down here. Yeah, thank you very much. It's mark.pickett@sae-itc.org. Pete, wonderful perspective. Really enamored with your background and your subject matter expertise. And certainly appreciate the fight that you're fighting every day. There's Pete's email address, peter.guinto@resilinc.com. Thanks everyone for your participation. Pete, thanks again. Thank you, Charlie. Thank you, Tracy. Everybody have a wonderful rest of their day.
Thanks for having me. Take care.
Bye now.